And we are recording. Hello, this is Danella Sands with MendoLake Complex Fire Relief, a disaster resource center in Mendocino County. We are doing an emergency preparedness webinar series. Some of you have joined us already, and we have a few more later today and tomorrow. And today we have Michael Jones, and he is a forest advisor with UC Cooperative Extension, Mendocino Lake and Sonoma. He's going to be talking about home hardening and defensible space. He'll give a short presentation, and then we'll open it to Q&A. There's a Q&A section on the Zoom. You can leave your questions there, or you can leave it in the comment section live on Facebook, and we'll ask him when he's done. Mr. Jones, are you ready?
Yes, I am.
Thank you. Go ahead.
All right, well, thanks for the introduction, Danella. My name is Michael Jones. I am a forest advisor with Cooperative Extension. And today I'm going to be talking about home survival in wildfire-prone areas. So really think about design and maintenance considerations. I just want to acknowledge my collaborators, Jana Valakovic, Steve Quarles, who have been fundamental partners and really been the drivers of this research, this resource, and have been pushing the materials in the community. And our collaborators in other organizations, the California Fire Science Consortium and the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. All right, so the first thing I want to talk about and how we want to think about this is, and I should preface the saying that when we think about home design and maintenance, that for the purposes of this talk, we're focusing from the home out, right? So we're starting with the home itself, the structure, and then we're working out into the defensible space. So I'll talk about a little bit more, but so we're thinking, just remember, we're thinking starting at the home. So how do structures ignite? Well, we have three primary methods of ignition occurring during wildland fires. We have direct flame contact, where the fire burns to the home. We have embers, where the fire creates firebrands or parts of burning vegetation that are blown in the winds ahead of the fire, causing spotting or they touch our structures. And then we have radiant heat, or we have the direct impact of heat against a structure, which can cause ignition as well. So these are all very important sources of ignition in wildland fires, and all things that we have to manage for and think about when we're creating defensible space and home hardening and managing to make our homes more resilient. But we know in the last few years with the recent fires that a significant portion of building ignitions occurred through embers. And so we're going to talk about how we can make our home more resilient to these embers. So what we have is simplify kind of the way we're going to talk about this. We think about the priorities of how we make our home more resilient. The first two, roof and vents, are critically important because those are very vulnerable to ember exposure. And we'll talk about each of these in brief detail. Then we have our vegetation, our defensible space. Arguably, vegetation defensible space is just as important as thinking about home hardening and how our structure is designed and maintained. But for the purposes of this talk, because remember we're starting at the house, working our way out, vegetation falls down under the largely important aspects of home hardening, which are roof and vents. But it's equally as important and must be as considered when you're thinking about this issue. And then we think about windows, decks, and siding. These are very critical elements of home design that are vulnerable to not only embers that are blown in ahead of the fire, but also through radiant and actual flame contact that occurs from vegetation near our home burning, or other structures that are burning adjacent to our homes, or from the wildfire itself. So these are kind of the criteria, and this is how we think about it and kind of how we prioritize how we are going to address issues in making retrofits or maintaining our homes. All right, so the first is roofs. In the red circle, we have basically our roof material, which is a Class A. We want to maintain Class A roof structure. It's very fire resistant. However, as you see in the yellow circles, roofs can have complexities. These complexities create vulnerabilities where things like litter or debris can accumulate, and embers will accumulate there as well during a fire event, and those can ignite. Those vulnerabilities can then, make their way through your roof into your home. So it's really important to think about maintenance of, even if the material and the quality of your roof is high and you just installed it and it's in really good shape, but if you have complex roof structures, that could potentially create vulnerabilities that have to be managed and maintained. Roof edges are critically important, right? These are spaces where embers can penetrate. Embers can get anywhere the wind's blowing, an ember can go. So if there's a space, an ember will find it. The surface of the roof may be Class A, but the under elements, the subsurface may not be, and they might be more vulnerable. That goes for roof edges that I mentioned, in gutter attachments and other attachments to the roof. Gutters can accumulate litter. Different types of gutter materials can have different behaviors during fire events. Plastic gutters can melt. Metal gutters can keep heat on your roof, as you can see in this larger image. So those are things to consider when you're maintaining your roof edge and your gutter structure. All right, next is vents. So when we think about vents, they're critical for our home. They create airflow so we can maintain moisture and the integrity of the home. And they just have really crucial roles, and they're everywhere, right? We have vents on the roof, we have vents under eaves, in the gable ends, in the foundation. So they're all over the home. And each of those is vulnerable to fire. And we know that the way they're constructed, oftentimes the embers can easily penetrate through those materials into the inner spaces of the home. And so a really easy retrofit that we recommend, and is something that you can go to Home Depot or a home store and buy material. Most vents today are constructed out of, old vents, and some newer vents are constructed out of 1/4 inch mesh screening. As you can see on the left side, an easy retrofit is to reduce the screen size to 1/8 inch material, right? And just that change in dimension, the diameter or the size of the squares will do a lot to prevent ember penetration into that structure. If you want to take it to the next level, you can look at California Building Code Chapter 7A, which actually outlines specifically vents that are designed to be fire resistant. And so they have different constructions that either will create like baffling or maybe even heat sensitive foam release that will prevent embers from penetrating or shut down. Another thing you do is on red flag days, or if you're concerned and fire might be coming towards you, you can actually just put plywood or other material over your vents to actually screen them off. All right, so priority 3, we're thinking about our defensible space, right? The whole point of defensible space is to reduce the amount of vegetation around our home. Typically, we think about it being 100 feet. That changes when we have different types of vegetation structures, topography, and there's a lot of different variables. But for the most part, we're thinking about a 100-foot space. And we have 2 zones currently defined. We have the defensible space zone, which is at 0 to 30, or the lean, green, and clean, we like to call it. You want a really park-like structure, really clean, spaced out vegetation. Then we have our 30 to 100, which is our reduced vegetation zone. And the idea is that we're just changing the structure of the vegetation so that as fire moves into the vicinity of our home, that we change the fire behavior. Either we drop it out of the canopy or it slows the rate of spread down. We're doing something that we're reducing the amount of vegetation, and that fire behavior changes such that first responders or fire crews can get in there and potentially stop the fire, or even it puts itself out. And so this is a really important zone for managing fires when they are moving on, when the actual fire front or some kind of ignition has happened, maybe embers or something have happened out in that vegetation and the fire is moving towards you. However, we know that a lot of ignitions that are happening, or the home loss or structural loss that we're experiencing right now, are embers blowing miles ahead of the actual flame front. So most of the time, we're not even seeing direct flame movement into a home or defensible space. Embers can just blow right through that and impact the home material, the material that makes up the home itself. And so we have to really think about these priorities that we're talking about. You have to make sure the materials that are blowing against that house or the materials that are being impinged on with embers are going to be resilient and well maintained to resist the damage that could be caused or catching on fire. But we're also thinking about, if there's vegetation right up against our home, that creates a fuel bed that can then create fire and heat right against our home and bypass the defensible space. So what we are developing was recently signed into law by Governor Newsom under the bill AB 3047, is called a zone 0. And so essentially what a zone 0 is, it's a 0 to 5 foot buffer that's created from the house 5 feet out. The idea is that you're changing the structure of the vegetation in this zone into a non-combustible zone. So that if embers were to land here, there's nothing for them to ignite, and then that heat or that flame contact is not up against the structure of your home, making it more resilient. Then you're still maintaining your zone 1, which is your 5 to 30, as your lean, green, and clean, and then your extended zone, your reduced vegetation. And so that's really this kind of key. We really think this is a key aspect of home defense and home hardening, is the zero zone. What does that look like? It's a non-combustible zone where you've reduced the chances of flame contact through direct exposure, ember ignition of vegetation, And the idea is that it has to be implemented all the way around your home. Use rock mulch, hardscape, or some kind of well-manicured green, low-growing lawn or kind of vegetation structure, so that if embers or fire were to approach it, there wouldn't be any continuity of that fuel and that fire wouldn't persist. And the focus is less on plants, not the types or what kinds of plants, but more on how we're placing those plants and how we're maintaining those plants, right? So this idea of having these foundation anchoring shrubs right against our home is not ideal for home hardening and defensible space. So we're implementing our best practices, right? In the top right, we have all that vegetation right against the house. The homeowners cleared it out. They changed the structure, and they're still maintaining the beauty, the aesthetics of the home in a way that they are happy, but also increasing the home hardening or the resilience of their home. So when we think about fire-resistant plants, do they have lists? Do we have recommendations? And the answer is no. There is no such thing as a fire-resistant plant. All plants will burn regardless of how they are marketed. In this photo on the right, you see those were cactus that burned in the Tubbs fire. What's really most important when we're thinking about fire-safe landscaping is maintenance. How are we maintaining that vegetation? We want to select low-growing, open-structured, low-resin, high-moisture content plants so that we don't have dense buildup of fuel and vegetation and a continuity of that fuel, which can ignite easily and hold fire against our home. And then we want to focus on, let's think about using native and drought-tolerant plants that can be maintained fairly easily and are also kind of important ecological parts of the landscape. And again, the most important part about plants within the 0 to 5 foot zone and also within your 100-foot defensible space zone is the placement, where those plants are located. All right, just quickly, I want to mention that mulch is an extremely important aspect of landscaping. It helps to maintain moisture and all kinds of things that help our plants grow and protect the soil, but mulch burns. And so you really want to think about how you place mulch on the landscape, and maybe you're going to want to keep it out of that 0 zone, that 0 to 5 foot space, because as you can see in the bottom right, that is mulch that caught fire from embers in the Tubbs fire. So that's just something to consider. It doesn't mean you have to get rid of it, but maybe you're thinking differently about how you're placing it in your landscaping. All right, so that's a quick overview of vegetation. Now we're going to look at priority 4, windows. Windows are really important because it's this complex figure on the left, but basically what happens is the car fire photo on the right is a really good demonstration. We have vegetation under the window that caught fire. That thermal gradient, the heating up of that outer pane caused that window to crack. But because this was a double pane window, the inner pane didn't crack. And so you did not lose the integrity of that window and created a pathway for embers or flames. And so maintaining high quality windows that are sealed in well and the double pane to have that thermal gradient is extremely important and will be very valuable in maintaining a resilient surface. Priority 5 are decks and attachments. So this can be fairly tricky and a very complex issue to address. But basically, you think about what a deck is, and it's really just another large surface area of combustible materials that if embers were to land on could potentially ignite and carry the fire to your structure or your home. And so maintenance is extremely critical. As you can see in this blow up of the picture on the right, we want to clean out litter and debris that accumulate against the home, but also maintain the quality of the wood. And maybe we're replacing some of the boards against the house with non-combustible materials, or we're doing foil tape like bitumen tape on the joists and areas to break up, again, that continuity of fuel so that if fire were to catch the deck, or if the deck were to catch on fire, that fire is not burning into and directly consuming the home structure. Maybe it's being put out or it's not building up a lot of heat and continuing to consume the deck. And also it's more resistant to embers if you kind of break up that fuel continuity. Another important part, I'm kind of sidetracking here, but is cleaning off your deck. So having natural fiber materials like benches or cushion chairs on your deck, those are very ignitable and embers can land on those, catch them on fire, and then create a source of heat and flame that then can catch your deck on fire. So I'll talk briefly about this at the end, but I call them my red flag day BMPs or best management practices. And one of those is to remove combustible items from your decks or structures adjacent to your home. Really important is to not store material of any kind on your deck. Basically on the photo on the left, what you have is kindling pile that embers will get to and will create conditions that will make it hard for your deck to resist catching on fire. So I don't think you need to maintain the deck on the right. That's a pretty austere and a dramatic example of a very well-maintained deck space, but certainly not on the left. You don't want to store a lot of wood or flammable or combustible material under there. Another type of attachment that we want you to think about are fences. And so fences can act like wicks and carry fire from one structure to another. And so one thing that we can do is to break up, again, that continuity fuel, and maybe we're putting metal gates or some kind of different material against our homes to break up that fence structure so that if fire were to move along the fence or embers were to catch that fence on fire, they're not going to ignite the home structure. Our last priority is siding. Siding is really important to maintain as well because we're thinking about embers or landing on the siding. You may have heat burning up, you may have heat impacting the siding, or you may have direct flame contact. So maintaining healthy siding is really important. Additionally, within that 0 to 5 foot defensible space, that non-combustible zone or zone 0, however you want to call it, we're maintaining that horizontal 5 foot clearance. But another important aspect of that is maintaining a 6-inch vertical clearance. Because what's happening is that if you see the top middle photo, that's the underlayment and the underside of the siding on top of the cinder block stem wall. And so what could happen if there's vegetation that is accumulating in that space, it can burn up under the siding. In the photo on the right, you see what happens is the fire is penetrating through the overlaps of the boards, through the lapping, and actually burning the wall from the inside. If you saw the other side of that photo, you wouldn't even really see most of that flame. And so we want that 6-inch clearance as well, because that way, if fire does get in there, there's a space that prevents those flames from reaching the siding, because that is definitely a more vulnerable area. So remember that zone 0 is a 0 to 5 foot non-combustible zone, but also has a vertical component of that 6-inch spacing. And so if you have grass there, or if you have vegetation, you got to maintain it and keep it mowed and keep it low and keep it green. All right, so take homes here. Just kind of key points that some of them I mentioned, some of them I haven't, that it's great to think about. I always find this fascinating, and something really that I think about but don't really recognize is that we don't fight earthquakes, we don't fight tornadoes, and we don't fight hurricanes, but we fight fire. And it's clearly, it's not working the way we are doing it right now. It's not a sustainable model. So we have to adapt, and we have to build smarter. We have to become fire adapted and think differently about how we build our homes, where we build our homes, and how we live on the landscape in a fire adapted ecosystem. We know that the majority of homes in the last few years have been lost by embers. And so we want to really implement that defensible space, the home hardening and critical 0 to 5 foot non-combustible zone. Fire safe landscaping is possible. That includes beauty, safety, privacy, and saves water. And that's totally up to your objectives and goals as a landowner. You can make it look however you want. You just want to try to maintain as best you can in that non-combustible zone. And again, I'll reiterate that placement of plants is key, and maintenance of those plants is essential, right? You can have a shrubby plant that's very green, but if you let it get big and old and senescent, it may build up a lot of woody fuels that create higher fire intensity conditions. So you have to make sure those plants are maintained in a way that they are more less susceptible to embers and more resilient. All right, and then I mentioned it, but one thing that we just had, this was a major success for my colleagues who have been pushing for this implementation of this into the definition of defensible space, is that non-combustible zone. You can look it up. It was just signed by Governor Newsom, AB 3074. All right, home design, maintenance, and construction can be more important than fire-resistant building materials. And that's just saying, like, you can have a redwood-sided house as long as you're maintaining that material or maintaining the vegetation. It can be fairly resilient to embers. It doesn't mean you need to build a cinder block bunker. You can still have some design elements in your home as long as you maintain that material. And then poor installation and lack of maintenance is certainly an extreme vulnerability in these products, right? So no matter what material you use, if you don't maintain it and it builds up vegetation or it builds up litter, or the material is, the coatings that protect it are flaking off or breaking or cracking, those are all vulnerabilities that you have to maintain. And regardless of what the material is, they make the house or structure more vulnerable. All right, so last thing I want to say is we have our red flag BMPs that I just mentioned, our red flag day best management practices. And so what I was talking about before, this defensible space, home hardening, the vegetation management, that's things that we can think about and implement year round. We can always be doing work on that. We can always be thinking about how we're going to make our home more resilient and how our landscape managed a little bit better. And these red flag day BMPs, here's and this is my personal approach, but here's what I think we do on red flag days or times where we high fire risk. So I mentioned it before, but one really important key is to move combustible items away from the house. So this is, lawn furniture or chairs with cushions, natural fiber doormats or things that are up against the house, a barbecue with a grill. All of these things can be easily moved away from the house under red flag conditions. A broom with straw bristles is a really awesome ember catcher that can ignite easily and impinge your house with fire. And so we're thinking about, this is my house, this is before red flag, and I just did this last weekend and actually today, which was a red flag warning in Sonoma County. And so this is what it looks like right now. And it's very extreme, but what I'm doing is I am removing that possibility of creating additional sources of material that can catch fire. If you're leaving for the day for work, or if you are leaving because you're concerned that the fire is getting close, make sure all your windows, pet doors, and skylights are closed. These are all vulnerabilities that embers can easily get into if they're left open. And then a really cool idea that I like to do and that my colleagues, we all do, no matter where our home is, whether it's in the urban or the rural environment, is that we put out ladder. You can see in that photo in the back corner of the house, there's a ladder laid out against the house. And then we have connected hoses on my steps. In the shade is a hose hooked up to the faucet or buckets of water. And this gives resources that if a fire were to come through your area and fire professionals were to show up, you've provided them resources that makes it easier for them to defend your home. And if I have a side gate, I make sure that's unlocked and open so they can get in there easily. And I create a space where they would feel comfortable and safe trying to defend your home. So that's that's before the fire gets there. In a case of evacuation, in which we're emergency evacuation because the fire is threatening our home or it's very close to our community, of course we have our go bags and we're thinking about all the things, having all our effects and all our animals and everybody together. But there's another really important thing to think about is, if you're under evacuation and you have an escape route that maybe it's windy conditions or maybe the fire's already burned through some of the community, you may have to get out of your vehicle to make that emergency route accessible. And so make sure you cover up. You need to have long sleeve pants or long sleeve shirts and pants that are natural fibers, so cotton and wool, to cover up, boots, good boots, hat, face coverings, and leather gloves, so that if you need to get out of your vehicle, you can easily kind of be protected from some of these extreme conditions. And it's always valuable to bring a tool. Maybe if you're out in a rural area and you need to clear roads on your driveway, a chainsaw, or maybe if you're in an urban environment, something like a handsaw or a shovel if you need to push that out of the road. So thank you for your time. And one last thing before I kind of finish up is I'll say is that, not all of us have 100-foot defensible space. And I should have mentioned this earlier, but really that can be tricky. I live in a relatively developed area and I don't have 100 feet around my home. And so what's really crucial is that you work with your neighbors to maintain that space as best you can. And if you're really close to other buildings and other structures that might ignite, then you should really prioritize what you're thinking about how that material that's most exposed to that heat is maintained. So your sidings, your windows, and your gutters, and the roof, and the vents, and all the structures that might be most vulnerable to that closest heat source. And so maybe your vegetation is important, but you're really focusing on your home hardening because you have less control of vegetation and you're more worried about close ignition. So that's the kind of, we think about this from two different aspects, but both very critically important in both urban and rural environments. So I just did a brief skip across the pond of these resources. We have a ton of information on these materials, as well as all things fire in California on our website. Here's the link. It's ucANR.edu/sites/fire/, or you can just type in your Google search engine, UCANR Fire in California, and it'll take you to this website. And we have all these amazing resources that can help you out. Additionally, I am the forest advisor for the area. If you have questions or follow-up and site visits, or you want to talk about these issues in further detail, you can always contact me at my email, mjones@ucanr.edu, or by phone at my office, 463-4495. And with that, if we have time, I will take any questions. And thank you very much for giving me your attention today.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. That was really well thought out. I really appreciated that. I learned a lot myself. Um, yeah, it was really nice. So I just want to remind everyone that's listening in on the webinar or on Facebook Live that you can ask the questions in the comment section or the Q&A on Zoom, and we will ask the speaker. We already did have some questions come in. So if you're ready for that, I will ask you. Okay. There's been a lot of talk about metal roofs. A lot of people after the Redwood fire changed their homes to have more metal. Is that helpful in a wildfire?
I mean, metal is certainly, a well-maintained metal roof is certainly class A, right? You know, wood is, or excuse me, it's really difficult for metal to catch on fire from embers. But again, their vulnerability excuse me, are that the underlayment or the material that the metal is constructed on is typically wood. So if you don't maintain the integrity of that metal surface, you have maybe you're overlapping sheets. If there's gaps, they're not sealed well, embers can penetrate under there. Also, if you have accumulation of debris on top of those roofs, they can ignite more combustible materials that aren't necessarily part of the metal. So as I pointed out in that very early slide, is that we have a class A roof, but we have all these complexities, and maybe the material on the roof itself is fire resistant, but all of the other parts of the roof may not be. So metal is great, and if you like the way it looks, and sometimes it can look really cool, and they're developing new ways of building it, and it certainly will go a long way in helping to maintain the fire resilience of your home, but it's not 100% guarantee that your home will be fire resistant.
Interesting, thank you. The next question is, a lot of people after the wildfires, especially in the last 5 years, have had difficulty getting fire insurance. Would working on the home hardening that you're discussing help them get insurance?
Yeah, this is a really complex issue that I wish I could answer very concisely, but I'm going to be very ambiguous and unclear here because it really depends on a lot of factors. Sometimes, and theoretically, an insurance company should work with you if you're willing to develop your defensible space in your home hardening, or if you're building a new home and you're incorporating the new Chapter 7A elements and the new WUI or wildland urban interface construction elements. Technically, some insurance companies will, take that consideration as they're deciding whether or not they're going to insure you. However, sometimes for individuals that are in high severity fire locations or at the whim of the insurance company, because they kind of have a lot of power right now in this sense, they can still deny you insurance. And it's something that we in Extension are working on. We're trying to figure out how to work with insurance companies to make sure that they are, acknowledging that we live in a fire adapted ecosystem and it's a risk, it's inherent risk, right? They provide flood insurance, we have earthquake insurance. These are all natural disturbances that occur. Fire should be thought of the same way. So as long as the homeowner is being responsible and doing the best they can to maintain their home, their defensible space, where they're placing their home, how they're building their home, it should be, the insurance company should be willing to invest. That being said, we're not at that point yet. It's still a serious issue that people are getting denied or getting their fire insurance removed, or it's exorbitantly expensive. And so hopefully in the future, we get to a point where it does actually mean a lot, where you invest a lot of resources in doing these things and it means that you are guaranteed insurance, but at this point we're not there.
Thank you for answering that. Okay, we're a couple of minutes away. We have time for a couple more questions. Let's see. Someone just made a comment that they never realized the red flag day. Suggestions have been made. Example, the ladder for fire personnel, that was helpful for them to learn. Good. And buckets of water. So they thanked you for that.
Good.
And then we have another question that said, are there any funds to help people remove trees around their property?
Yeah, another tricky one. If you have a large property, you can get things like these cost share programs through CAL FIRE or the federal agency NRCS, but they don't really do vegetation management within the defendable space. Typically, that is the state and the local governments really believe that that's the responsibility of the landowner. However, if you have a fire safe community or a fire wise community, or your community has a CWPP, a wildfire protection plan, they can apply for funding and actually help you get this work done. And those are really valuable groups to reach out to. So I know that Scott Craggy talked previously, and he's the kind of that's the entity, the Mendocino Fire Safe Council is the kind of organization that you could go with and get small grants to do the work. That being said, a lot of this work you can do yourself when it's small vegetation, small trees, small shrubs, grasses. I just take a weekend and do some work every once in a while, cleaning up the space. So, you know, at the end of the day, a lot of the work you can get yourself when possible, and there are some funding sources, but that's also another thing we're working on, is trying to figure out more robust mechanisms of funding this defensible space management, because it's not always something that homeowners can do themselves, nor is it realistic to expect them in some of these situations, given that, you know, they live in the redwoods or there's big trees near their homes. So again, not a clear answer, but there are routes, and I would check with the Fire Safe Council to see what they're funding, because they're doing a lot of roadside clearing and a lot of defensible space work right now that they always get some funding to help landowners do.
Excellent, thank you. The next question is, I'm a renter and I've done all the work around my property, but there's a giant old tree next to my house. What information can I share to the owners of the property from your websites?
I think, you know, and we have some publications coming out that might help with that, but if you really focus and show them about how critical that 0 to 5 foot zone is, how maintaining that vegetation, you know, having trees within even the lean green 30-foot zone is great, but when you have branches that grow up over your house, maybe they're not touching the roof, but they're creating a lot of leaf litter. And so maybe your gutters are filling up with debris, or there's lots of debris built up in valleys and corners on your roof. And so there's a lot of value in showing them that these kinds of vegetative materials next to the house can have a serious impact on survivability of the home. So I guess what I would do is kind of show them that we have this new 0 to 5 foot zone. It's been signed in as a bill. It may take a while, but eventually it will become public resource code, and CAL FIRE, as they currently have the ability to enforce the zone 1 and 2, the 30 and 100 foot, will eventually be able to enforce management of the 0 to 5 foot zone. So I think that might be an incentive, that if you have a vegetation that is creating a mess around your home, at some point it will become a permit violation or a violation of the code, and it will be enforced. And also communities more and more are developing vegetation abatement codes that they will go in and see an issue, for example, Lake County, they will do the work themselves and then charge the landowner back for that. So there's, unfortunately, you know, try the carrot, but you know, the stick, we see more and more of the stick being used to kind of enforce this defensible space. So try to work with them and really show them that you're concerned about it, and that it's an investment in the resiliency and protection of their building.
Excellent, thank you. The last question we have is, this seems like a lot of expenses that I cannot afford right now. Where would you suggest that I start?
Yeah, it can be extensive, and it's tough, because top priority, that no matter where your home is located, what your vegetation type is the roof. And that's just not, if you don't have a Class A roof, you got an old redwood shake roof, you know, that's not an easy thing to fix overnight. But it's so critically important that it's really something that we need to think about. I think for myself, what I do is I made sure that I cleaned up my 0 to 5 foot zone, because that's something I can control. I rent, I can't do a lot of work in my home. So I beefed up and enforced my 0 to 5 foot zone. I did my lean and green cleaning around my home, or I'm working on it. And then things like vents, because vents are very vulnerable to embers, I'm retrofitting all my vents. I have tons of under-eave vents and stem wall vents, and I'm going through, and I got permission. I'm taking the screens off, adding that 1/8 mesh size, and then reattaching the screens. And it will go a long way to help protect my home, and make it, you know, kind of makes me feel better that I'm actually doing something. And so I would start with the chunks that you can get at, and that usually that's the vegetation management and vents and things like that. And unfortunately, you know, there are some serious high expense retrofits that have to be done, that there's no real way around that. So it can be a significant hindrance. Hopefully we create, you know, all these mechanisms of funding, but hopefully with fire safe councils and funding from the federal government, we can develop grant funding to help people retrofit home. And that's the ultimate goal, is that we're not only funding people to do the defensible space work, but we're also helping them do home hardening and retrofitting their homes. But again, this is very new and we're not there yet.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Just wanted to close out by thanking Michael Jones here And we're going to be adding all of his contact information that he is linked with for more information on the top of the Facebook post. So if you'd like to reach out to them, or if you have any other questions. Also, if you're just joining us, this will be aired on Facebook at a later viewing in the YouTube channel. Is there anything else you want to close with, Michael?
Yeah, no, I mean, I really thank you for your time. I appreciate y'all listened, and those questions were great. And check out that Fire in California website. It's just a really great, we're compiling all of the information on fire, thinking about fire ecologically, fire as a tool, so using prescribed fire, and then how we prepare for fire and what we do after fire. And so there's all those resources are in one place. You can do a deep dive and get a real good understanding in much more detail of home hardening, defensible space, and all these issues. And as always, I am more than happy to do site visits and work with people if they need some advice. So just thank you for your time, and Daniela for putting this together. This is great.
Thank you. Well, good. Well, thanks for coming, and you have a good
course.
day. I'm going to go ahead and conclude our meeting.
All right.
Thank
Pleasure.
you. Bye.
Bye.